I'd like to begin with a brief introduction of UR POLIS before moving on to introduce our panelists for today's event, I guess, and the format of today's event. For those of you who may not know, UR POLIS is a political science and international studies student association at the University of Regina. We represent all students pursuing bachelor's, minors, or certificates in political science, international studies, and interdisciplinary programs such as PPE, politics, and economics. For more information about our work, check out our link tree that will be posted in the chat function. I encourage all of you to take a look and message us if you have any further questions or interest in UR POLIS. As part of our mandate is spreading civic engagement amongst students at the University of Regina, as well as youth in broader communities in Saskatchewan. We will fulfill that mandate today by discussing foreign policy, the United Nations, and we will begin with introducing our panelists, followed by a structured discussion with an audience Q&A. If you would like to ask one of our panelists a question during the Q&A portion of today's event, please direct message Evan and indicate whether you would like to answer the question out loud or have Evan read it for you. With that being said, Evan will now introduce our panelists, and who graciously thank for taking time out of their busy schedules to join us today.
Thank you, Sophia. I would first like to introduce Kaneez Anwar. Kaneez received her Bachelor of Arts from Fairfield University, double majoring in politics and international studies with a minor in American studies. During her undergrad, she volunteered for a variety of different events at the UN, participated in an interfaith dialogues and humanitarian events on campus, and interned for a congresswoman. All her experiences at Fairfield reinforced her passion to make a difference, but she didn't really know how and is still learning. After college, she worked for a local consulting firm focusing on education and healthcare projects. Being able to combine those interests in education and healthcare, she moved on to administer a federal program, Medicaid, to help low-income special needs students receive health-related services in her hometown school district. Her studies and work had been pretty local, and while she's grateful for those local experiences, she decided to pursue a research master's and study globalization at Dartmouth College, really committing to the Think Global, Act Local philosophy. She's currently working as a consultant for a growth strategy firm, Beacon Group, to develop her business acumen. Welcome, Kaneez.
Hey, guys.
Next, we would like to welcome Devira. Devira was born and raised in Indonesia. She is currently pursuing global studies at Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto, Japan. As an international student, she has indulged in numerous international activities related to her studies. She served as a delegate in the 25th Youth Assembly in New York City in 2020, as well as the Indonesia Model United Nations in 2021, representing the Czech Republic. She loves to challenge her academic abilities in competitions like Future You Want Model United Nations in 2018, where she was awarded for the Best Position paper. In 2018, she was also appointed as the head of the Brunei Darussalam delegation in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations Model Interparliamentary Assembly. Outside of academics, she loves channeling her hobbies through various clubs and organizations within and outside of school. She is currently the Chief of Social and Cultural Division of Indonesian Student Associations and has the social media team in Extinction Rebellion Indonesia. Welcome, Devira.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity today. I hope we can have a great time. Thank you.
Thanks for being with us. Next, I'd like to welcome Katrina Lambert. Katrina is 20 years old, originally from Scotland, but is currently studying politics and international relations at the London School of Economics, focusing her studies on human rights and gender equality. She's also been an active campaigner on human rights and a youth voice since the age of 15, working with organizations from the Scottish Parliament and Children's Commissioner to the United Nations. She's currently working with the UK government and youth sector to ensure that young people are at the heart of the COVID recovery. Welcome, Katrina.
Hi, everybody. Really excited to be here.
Thank you. Our final panelist is Remi Guindon. Remi attended the University of Calgary for 2 years, studying international relations, before transferring to the University of British Columbia. Her degree was conferred at the University of British Columbia to International Relations and Political Science, with a concentration in United States politics and race relations. She's had a very positive experience studying at both the University of British Columbia and the University of Calgary, because it allowed her to take a diverse assortment of courses. While attending the University of Calgary, she has had the opportunity to engage with a multitude of unique international relations courses. While at the University of British Columbia, she was able to take various political science courses not offered at the University of Calgary. The University of British Columbia had several different avenues to explore political science, such as Indigenous politics, environmental politics, public policy, and foreign policy. Her shift from an international studies degree came after she realized she had an interest in the cogs and mechanisms of US politics, particularly the role of race relations in US politics. Welcome, Remi.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Thanks, Evan. We'll move right into our structured discussion portion of today's event. We kindly ask that all members of the audience please mute their microphones and refrain from using the general chat function. We will call on the panelists in no specific order. We'll begin with our first question. Why did you choose to pursue a degree in international affairs? Katrina.
Oh, first, no pressure. I think for me, so when I was younger, I was very much not interested in politics, international affairs. I have like diary entries from when I was 8 going, stupid politics, what is this? Everybody gets all upset about it. So I can't like pinpoint the exact moment where there was a transition away from that. There obviously, I'm pleased to say there has been. But I think for me, I've always been a very kind of solutions focused person. And it's always like when there's injustice or inequalities or issues in the world, like my kind of immediate thought is, right, what can we do to fix that? How can we go about solving that? And I think that so much of that requires collaboration and sharing of ideas. And you only really get that when you look at issues like gender inequality or health inequalities, when you only get the kind of real understanding of how to solve those problems when you look at it at an international level. So I think for me, it was that combination of wanting to be able to create solutions and kind of look at policy, but for me, the kind of international side of that is really important as well, to actually really collaborate and learn from other people to make sure that those solutions actually work. So I think that's how I ended up doing my degree. Might be a different answer in a year's time, who knows?
That's awesome. Thank you so much. All right, Kaneez.
You guys hear me? Okay. So I guess in terms of how sorry if you hear like the beeping, it's because technically I'm working right now. So like I have things going on, but yeah, when I was younger, I knew I wanted to help people. I just didn't know what that meant. And I think because I'm brown, so like my parents are South Asian, my parents are immigrants from Bangladesh, there's definitely an emphasis to go into STEM. So I thought that maybe I'll just become a doctor and that's the best way to help somebody and, you know, to really provide that direct care. But then pretty quickly when I was in high school, I started doing Model UN because I was a really anxious person growing up, and I was just really shy. I didn't like to speak with people. I was not very extroverted and had like really bad, just like social anxiety. So then getting into Model UN really helped me kind of branch out of that. And then I was like, wait, the world is so much bigger than like me and my city. It's so cool. Like, I just thought it was me and my city and like, I guess wherever my parents are from, some distant land, you know, on the other side of the planet. But pretty quickly, like, did Model UN. And I thought when I went to college, I'll do like Model UN, like definitely. And I was going to do like a major in international studies, but also be pre-med. And then pretty quickly, I realized that like medicine was not for me. Like I took a couple classes and I was like, I don't like this. But I was really excelling in, I guess, my social sciences and humanities classes. And I was really getting out of my shell. So I guess that's really what forced me to kind of like, I felt like I had no other choice. I'm like, I got to pick the one thing I'm good at. And apparently it's government. So then I quickly double majored in politics and international studies because I was like, I want to make a difference. And I think this is the way how. So I don't know if that was that answering your question.
Yes, that's amazing. Awesome. Thank you so much. All right, Devira.
Wow, all of you guys have a very, very, I don't know, like very like grounded like reasons to study IR. Personally, for me, I just want to travel around the world. That's the first thing that came up to my mind. Like when I study like global affairs, like international studies, that means that I study about other countries. I learn about other people culture, and I can meet a lot of people, and I think I would look really cool with suit and just like get on stage and talk, give speech. But I think I was gonna do med school first when I was in high school, but I changed my mind like at the last minute in when I was in senior, and that kind of shocked my parents apparently, and because my mom really wanted me to become a doctor, but then I told my mom that I think I have a passion in politics and just basically gender equality. I'm really passionate about that, and I'm studying that in college now. So I told my parents about it, and they were pretty shocked, especially knowing that I wanted to study abroad. And I've never lived abroad. My family has never like all of us like has never like been like study abroad or live abroad. So that kind of shocked my parents. But then the more I learned about IR, I realized that I kind of have like this share the same passion as like I want to help people just in a different way, not becoming a doctor, but becoming a good leader, or like an important person that can actually change, like make policy that can help people out there. So I think that's also one of the biggest like reason why I want to study IR. And when I started college, I really like it. I really enjoy studying it. So yeah. That's all.
Thank you so much. All right, Remi.
My story, funny enough, is very similar to Kaneez's. I always knew I want to help people. My mom's side of the family is Punjabi, so obviously right away they're like, go into doctor, be a doctor, doctor, doctor. I knew from a very young age that social sciences was more the route that I was going to take, mostly because I was really bad at math. So I knew from a very young age that I wanted to get into some sort of social sciences. I actually started my undergrad in history, and then I realized it wasn't exactly what I wanted to do, just because it was more of what had happened versus, hey, how can I help current events? I kind of always had an innate curiosity about how countries or different states got along, or that lack thereof. So I figured international relations would be a good kind of way to learn more about these things. I kind of wanted to learn more of how policy is formed in regards to current events, to kind of try and stop history from repeating itself. Like I said, I was in international relations with a concentration in Middle East history. But when I got to UBC, I kind of realized, hey, US politics is kind of more my niche, but I realized they had such a global impact, just in terms of internal and external, like foreign policy. So I thought that would be a good route to go down. So that's kind of where I ended up.
That's amazing. Oh my God, I love you guys so much. I'm just putting that out there. You guys are amazing. So our next question is, what is your dream career, and what barriers have you felt in trying to pursue that career in a field like IS or IR? Devira, you can go first. Start us off.
Oh wow, okay. This is actually one of like a difficult question to answer, because I've I've have a lot of dreams in my life, and especially when I got to college, I kind of like changed my dream. Instead of becoming a doctor, I want to do something in IR field. But I think my biggest dream, or my dream career right now, is that I want to build my own NGOs that specifically work to assist with humanitarian aids. So, for example, like I facilitate a cooperation between different international actors to improve education system in Southeast Asian countries, for example. So, to achieve this is such a big dream, knowing that a lot of organizations are, you know, established now because of how easy right now, like we're moving to digital era where a lot of people have more access to the internet, and it's just like easier for you to attract more people, to raise awareness. So I think the biggest barriers for this is that define authenticity of your own organization. So what is authentic about your organization that you have to offer that no other organization has to offer? So I think finding these authentic ideas, or something that no other organization has, is could be some of the biggest obstacle to build that. And also, like, you have to be really determined to make sure that your organization works and could actually help people as what it's exactly, the objective of the organization. And also, like, the other barriers would be the number of organizations that work in the same field, have the same objective as your organization, and most likely have the same structure of the organization is a lot. So you have to kind of compete with other organization to, you know, to make your organization like stands out in the global world or global scale. Yeah.
That's amazing. That's awesome. I would love to see that happen. That would be amazing.
I think we can cooperate. Yeah, we can make this happen together.
That'd be awesome. I mean, I'm
That would be cool. Yeah, that's true.
all right, Remi, your turn.
Okay, mine is not nearly as cool as that answer. I initially wanted to pursue international human rights law. I think kind of initially a lot of students are like the grandiose, like what is the biggest kind of thing I can do with this degree? So that's where I ended up. I just realized talking to friends that had gone that route and professors, I realized in Canada it's very lack of opportunity, for a better word, to try and pursue these things. There's not a lot of international law schooling in Canada. You have to kind of go elsewhere. I know a couple places in Canada have classes you can take, but there's not an outright international law degree. So I kind of did a 180. I was very set on doing American foreign policy, going to law school. And then at that point, I'd realized I'd played my entire, or I'd gone through school playing varsity soccer. And so I kind of realized how much of a vehicle sport was in terms of globalization and what that could mean. So now I've kind of decided that I'm actually studying for my LSAT, and I'm hoping to go into international sports law. So that's kind of where I've ended up. And I'm excited, to see where that goes, because I know it's a very niche thing. So yeah, that was my kind of journey.
That's amazing. That's awesome. I love that. Katrina, your turn.
Wow, I feel like everyone's just got their life sorted out. This is so exciting. I think for me, I really struggle to conceptualize like what is the specific like job or like thing that I want to do. So my approach has always been like, I need to find something which I'm good at, something which I'm interested in, and then something that has some sort of impact. And I think as I've been going through, I've been able to figure out what that isn't. And then I'm getting closer to figure out what that is. So I think initially I was quite interested in like diplomacy, and then actually had some really super interesting conversations with like current working diplomats, and just heard about what like their role and what their job is like. And I think I realized that wasn't necessarily the space where I was going to make the kind of change I wanted to. So I would say it's something I'm still very much working through, but I think things in the kind of policy sphere, and particularly related to kind of gender policy and human rights policy, kind of trying to get that balance between how do we get kind of systems at like a really high level to then go down and actually have impact on the ground. So I think that sort of like area is where I'm very interested in going towards. The careers department at my university, or they're like, you need to be a little bit more focused. And I'm like, no, it's fine, it will come in time. But I would say that particularly that kind of like gender policy space is one that I'm really interested in. But I think one of the biggest barriers when it comes to kind of careers and figuring out what you want to do is that bit of just like, what is it you want to do? What do you want to get out from it? I think there's a lot of pressures, like my university, for example, there's a big focus on kind of banking and investment and very kind of like economics and money orientated careers, which is just really it's not something that's up my street. So it's kind of, I've had to know that, right, that's not for me, and be able to focus on what is. So I say that's probably one of the biggest barriers, actually just figuring out what it is you like and don't. But that's my approach. Figure out what I don't want to do, and then eventually we'll figure out what I do want to do.
That's awesome. I think that's a great approach to that, finding that your your career and what you want to do and narrowing it down. All right, Kaneez, your turn.
Yeah, well, I guess like my dream career, I think when I started doing Model UN's type stuff, I realized what I think that when you're in a position of privilege, you don't quite know. I mean, that's kind of like the benefit of being privileged, that you don't know you're privileged. So being an American, I think I never really thought about, just because before I was an American, I was a person of color and I was Muslim on top of that. But then pretty quickly I realized, like through like my high school experience in Model UN and then going into college and doing Model UN there and just studying politics and international relations, like I was like, oh my gosh, like it is so, like I had no idea how powerful it was to have a blue passport, you know, like just being a citizen of the US, it was like this huge mind-blowing thing, which, you know, I never considered. It was more like, I think when you are growing up as a person of color in the US, it's a definitely, and I'm sure you guys have been watching the news and stuff, like it's a very tumultuous experience for sure, for minority groups here. But then I think because of these experiences, I was like, I would love to be a diplomat. Like I would love to actually go into the foreign service. But the problem is, like, I think this is one of, and I don't know how much you guys know about like the American system, but in our I guess government overhauling, huge overwhelming system, like not just here and abroad, but the foreign service or the State Department is actually probably one of the most like equitable places to work at. So unlike a lot of other industries or departments or even like within government, they're really good about trying to get not only the best of the best in there, but they make it really hard to get in. So like, it's just the barrier to entry is crazy high. So for me, it's like, you know, people don't just go into the foreign service after they've finished school. You know, this is like a mid-level career. So this is something that you're really going to do probably in your 30s or 40s. And even then, I'm being like a little generous. It's probably a little bit later than that. Like I've known people who they've taken, and the process is super long. Not only do you have to take a test, there's different levels of that test. And then you have to go through different rounds of interviews, and then they have to check your background. It's a whole bunch of stuff. And then you get put on a wait list for a year. If you do pass all your exams and you pass the medical clearance, and they might not even pick you by the end of the year, in which case, if they don't, then you have to start the process all over again. So the barrier to entry is crazy high. Like, I think the actual percentage of people who start the process, get in and actually stay there, like who actually get in there and like get a job offer with the State Department is probably like 3%. So it's harder to get into the State Department than it is to get to Harvard, okay? Just to give you like a glimpse of how difficult that is. So in the meantime, I was thinking about like, I think something, and I'm sure like other international studies students, international relations politics students figured out in school, is that you quickly learn how to identify problems. And it's really easy to just be like, the world sucks, it's a terrible place, there's so many issues, like where do you even start, right? And it's really overwhelming. But I think it's important to note that like, that's just your beginning of the journey, right? If you want to do like social impact, if you want to make a difference, like I think something that they don't stress enough about in school, and I wish they did this more, is to be, I think like Remi was talking about, or somebody was talking about being like more, I think it was Katrina, talking about being more solutions oriented. So that's kind of the reason why I was like, all right, like I'm not quite at the level where I feel confident in myself and in my decisions to recommend policy change or to kind of like enforce a decision. And I think that's something that as students of like international studies and international relations and politics, we also have to be pretty self-reflective about our own capacity. Because I think it's really easy in this field to kind of get caught up in ego. Like, oh, I want to work at the UN. I want to work for the State Department. It's like the big thing is right? Like, I want to make a difference. I want to make a social change, right? And then you kind of forget in the process that there is a larger world out there for you to be a part of. Like, you're only one person in this member of the human race, right? So if you really want to talk about like uplifting and empowering and making like changes in communities, like it really starts in the communities. It doesn't start really with you. It doesn't start with your ego. So for me, I was like, all right, like I had kind of like in the pandemic, I'm sure everyone's done a lot of self-reflection. For me, I was thinking about like, all right, I'm really good at research. I'm really good at talking to people now. Like I feel a lot more confident in those things. However, I'm not quite at the point yet where I'm like, I can make sustainable like solutions where I can kind of create something from nothing. And for me, I was kind of looking at business because business is a really interesting field where like people are really effective. even if they are morally corrupt. So for me, I was like, okay, you got to go in and out, right? Like get into these fields where you're not traditionally like represented. Like people from social science, people from humanities aren't in fields like, investing or like in banking or consulting, like I'm in. And it's a shame because I think sometimes we really get caught up in this idea of like the only way you can make a difference is by working for government or working for a nonprofit. And that's true, definitely acknowledge that. But also there's so many other ways to kind of pick up other skills that you can apply to those sectors. So for me, my long-term game plan has always been go into the private sector for a couple of years, really pick up some tangible skills. Like right now, for example, I'm doing growth strategy. I didn't even know what that phrase meant 3 weeks ago when I started, right? Like very new to me. But now like at this firm where I'm basically doing research for different types of clients, and they ask you a question like, hey, what's the market for this? Or what's that? And I'm really applying my research skills. And hopefully my goal is that I can actually come up with growth strategies for the client. And I'm hoping I'm going to take this experience with me elsewhere in other fields. And for me, I think it's so important to kind of merge these two, like kind of like, I guess, the workflow of the private sector and like really bring those kind of skills into the public sector. Because I think it's really easy in the public sector where you have a lot of idealists, right? Everyone wants to make a difference. Everybody is so passionate and it's amazing. And it's really great to be surrounded by so much like energy. But in terms of like practice, like how can you actually do that? Like that's when we kind of throw our hands up and be like, oh my God, this is too complicated. And it's really easy to give up. So I guess in the long term, my dream career was diplomacy, was going to the public service somehow. But now I'm thinking more like, I wonder if there's other routes to kind of like other ways to kind of merge the private and social sectors together. So I'm thinking a little bit more about like social impact in terms of like sustainable microfinance and things like that, but we'll see. I'm not quite there yet. I still feel like I'm young, even though I know I'm getting older.
That's awesome. I love that idea. I think that's awesome. And I think sometimes I feel like in Canada too, we're seeing that shift too, where a lot of the public sector is now business oriented and how they approach different things. All right, so our next question is, what are your thoughts on your country's choices in regards to foreign policy and diplomacy, and what changes would you like to see? So Kaneez, we'll start with you this time.
Oh, okay, I'm on a roll. Well, I'm an American, so there's a lot to be said there. I don't know if I'm the only American over here, but yeah. So I would say it's funny because I think every time there's a presidential election, people really get fired up. And they think that, and it's funny because the domestic agendas are completely different from candidate to candidate, like from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. But the foreign policy pretty much is identical. Like, I think with Trump being the minor exception, like for the most part, your foreign policy pretty much stays the same from administration to administration. So if you compare the policies of Bush's regime, like they were kind of carried out by Obama. So like, people really want to talk about like, the issue of immigration in the US is like a Republican issue, or like it's so conservative on this. And it's like, no, the Democratic Party has its hands dirty too. Like nobody's really clean cut or truly super liberal out there with their policies. So for me, I guess in terms of like policies I would like to see changed, I would say like our immigration needs like massive overhaul and reform. Like we need to make it easier for people who've been in this country for a long time to get citizenship, and I think there's something to be said about like the kind of level of racism in my country right now, but also just in terms of just the kind of moral values we put on different types of labor. So I've noticed just going to a school that had, like, I went to Dartmouth for my graduate school, and it was like, we had so many international students come in from like all over the world, and it was easier for them to get residency or to get their work permits despite being in the country for like maybe 2 or 3 years just for their studies than it was for farmers in like California picking avocados to get their work permits, and they've been here for like 20 plus years. And I'm just like, clearly there's some racism in like how you're attributing value to different types of labor. So like if you're getting IT engineers from India, like you're giving them work permits to stay here to continue to work in Silicon Valley and make tons at Google, right? But then for the same people who are providing our food, it's like, you don't have that same respect. You don't give them the same decency. You don't give them that same, like, you don't give them the same access, which is crazy. So for me, yeah, definitely immigration is a huge issue that I think it needs to be changed. And that's more like and it's funny because you asked for foreign policy, that's not really foreign policy, it's more like domestic. But I think it does relate to the world too, because the thing is, we are really taking the best of labor from abroad and bringing them here in terms of like, technical capacities and stuff like engineers, IT people, like all of that stuff. But, it's also kind of creating a brain drain in other places too. So that's kind of an issue. I think that like, because we're pretty much bringing in so many people here to do those kind of specific jobs instead of providing them opportunity to do that back home, it's creating this kind of gap where like a lot of people who are overrepresented here in the US, like engineers, scientists, they're underrepresented in their home countries. And that's definitely an issue. And I think that we're creating that problem for sure. I guess other issues, foreign policy, it's just Middle East policy is always a disaster. It's always just like, it's always kind of a hotbed of issues. Like, I don't even know where to start with that. But, I think when it really, like, if you're looking back in the past couple of years, I think with Syria, that was like a massive mistake on Obama's administration. And I think I understand why they did that. Like, there's a really great piece of The Atlantic about it. And he really wanted to keep his clean cut image of not getting involved with the Middle East, which is fair. But then you have to understand that as like a huge superpower in the world, like we do have a moral obligation to step in when things like genocide take place. Like, I think if you have the power, you have the capacity, you have the influence to really do something about it. Like, it sucks because I think the US does play the really delicate role of being like, a superpower, and it has almost like a moral police. At the same time, it's like, you don't want to act like a cop. Like, you don't want to be international police. So the US is always in a really weird spot in regards to foreign policy, and it always takes the wrong step, I think, at least in the past like decade or so. That's 2 decades for sure. So in terms of what I would like to see changed, I would like to see a lot changed. Maybe like a massive overhaul of like all our foreign policy, like, in terms of just like, there's so many things that we got to improve on. And the thing is, it's so much easier for the US to kind of do those kind of changes than it is for like a smaller country that doesn't have the infrastructure, doesn't have the capacity. But right now, I think, after working, so I was actually working for a government agency before as well at the Board of Education. And it's not some place I thought was like a politicized area, because I was like, it's education, we're all on board. No, I realized pretty quickly that any kind of bureaucratic regime is bureaucratic. So it's like, there's just so many different levels. But yeah, I don't want to go off too much, but that's my shortcut. Yeah.
Awesome. That's great insight. I loved it. Devira, your turn.
Oh, wow. Okay. I think it would be like a drastic change because Indonesia, we're very neutral. So basically, Indonesian foreign policy, our diplomacy, we have this like a very fundamental principles that has been created since 1948, if I remember correctly. So basically, we have this called free or independent and active foreign policy diplomacy, meaning that independent, that Indonesia doesn't side with world powers. And this kind of like give us in a very weird position in political sphere, because we cannot really side with hegemonic powers. For example, like, okay, we have a good relationship with US, but we also have a good relationship with China. And that kind of, sometimes it kind of pisses US off. And sometimes we lose more investment when knowing that we have more agreement with the Chinese government. So sometimes it put us in a very vague, weird position. So and that's the first one about the independent foreign policy. About the active foreign policy that we have is that Indonesia has to remain neutral, but also at the same time that we have to kind of extend our policy that like passive and also reactive stand on international issues. For example, like a genocide, or right now we are on the issues like Israel and Palestine conflicts. So we have to remain neutral, but also at the same time we have to provide with any type of contribution to this kind of international issues. So I think this kind of policies, foreign policies, has been criticized a lot because a lot of people, especially like people who work in the IR field, saying that consider this policy as like vague and kind of limited our like has as a very limited practical implications on our diplomacy. So that's the thing that I would love to, I'm looking forward to change, because not only that we sometimes lose credibility when it comes to international conflicts, but also at the same time it kind of like restricts our movement, like become a, like kind of a strain of isolationism, so like remaining apart from other political affairs of some countries or particular groups. So yeah, that's the thing that I want to change, but I don't think that there would be like a huge reform on it. Maybe just a little bit change, like maybe like Indonesia will side on this conflicts just a little bit, but I don't think that would be like a huge reform on it, because it's like a foundation of our diplomacy for this whole time, for the past, I don't know, like decades or 7 decades. So yeah.
That's awesome. Great insight. All right, we're running a little bit behind, so try to keep them your response a little bit more brief. Remi, your turn to answer.
Kaneez, I am American, so I feel your pain with everything US foreign policy wise. But for me, it's even more frustrating because living in Canada, being a dual citizen, everyone kind of knows we're riding the coattails a little bit of every single US foreign policy decision that is being made. Canada is genuinely known as a pretty pacifist, small player in foreign policy. So that's obviously something that I would like to see changed. I get Canada's enormous dependence on US in terms of trade for consumer goods and jobs. So that's kind of where Canada's pro-American position on most foreign policy issues over the years has come from. But it's also a little bit frustrating to see as well. Same thing with Canada's relationship with like a China and Saudi Arabia, mostly for those trade reasons. But it's also Canada looking away on a lot of human rights issues in terms of the Uyghurs, or in terms of everything Saudi Arabia is doing, especially to women and children and those things. So it's kind of tough. Trudeau's rhetoric, or the Canadian rhetoric, is, hey, yeah, this isn't okay. In terms of, like, for example, Saudi Arabia, like, we are going to pressure from human rights groups. You're like, hey, you got to stop selling military equipment to Saudi Arabia. Trudeau goes, yeah, okay, we'll try a couple small things. We'll try and freeze trade, see what happens. Doesn't really work. Year later, they are doubling. As of like 2020, I think they doubled their weapon sales to Saudi Arabia, despite everything with like Khashoggi and everything Saudi Arabia intervention in Yemen. It's tough to see that the Canadian government takes such a, I guess for lack of rhetoric, way of dealing with things. Like, yeah, this is terrible to us, and then on their foreign policy platform, we don't really do a lot. So it's tough because, I guess, because we are so small and we depend on trade and jobs with these three big kind of players, it doesn't really leave us in a great position. One thing I'd kind of like us to take a better and bigger step on is just trying to thwart the rise of like illiberalism. I know it's kind of happening a lot with people that we are allied with, in terms of like Hungary, Poland, even France is kind of starting to see that populism rise, which doesn't necessarily mean good things on the international sphere. So I think if we can take a more hard red line in terms of speaking up when those atrocities are committed, and kind of committing to try and, I guess, regulate or try and somehow pressure them to back down in terms of doing things either foreign policy wise or domestic policy wise, would be great. I get it's a delicate balance, and Canada obviously, by all means, especially in recent light, is not perfect itself in terms of moral high ground with things happening in our own country. I just think that we need to take a more outward stance morally. So that's, I think, what we should do.
Very well said. I agree with everything you just said. Katrina, your turn.
Yeah, so I think kind of UK foreign policy is very much in a state of transition at the moment, and definitely it's not a kind of transition I think I'm particularly supportive of, and I think it's where, like originally being from Scotland and kind of having spent a lot of time in Scottish politics, I can very much see there's a divergence in kind of cultures and attitudes there playing out in the foreign policy field. And I think that the UK is very much pivoting towards being quite isolationist, withdrawing a lot. A lot of this comes from, obviously we had Brexit and the UK is no longer part of the European Union, and that relationship is still not completely cordial. There's not as much kind of collaboration as there was kind of talk that there was still going to be. We have issues in Northern Ireland that are still ongoing and not resolved. And so I think that is a big, like it's very much still playing out, and no one's really quite sure what the outcome will be. But I think the outcome will be a UK that is much more isolationist and has the ability to have much less impact. And I think that another kind of area where a lot of kind of things that are happening culturally, politically, is playing out in the foreign policy field is the kind of recent decision around the aid budget in the UK, which was, so we recently had the G7 meeting down just a few hours outside of London. The UK was the only G7 nation that committed to cutting its aid budget, so it's now below the UN target. And that, a lot of people here are very unhappy about that, and like that has kind of caused a lot of anger, but equally there's a lot who are very supportive of that, and that, you know, the UK should exist just for the UK. Very much the America first ideology is arriving and I think is growing in strength in the UK. So there's developments which I'm not that keen on in UK foreign policy. I think a lot of it will see how it plays out, but that is my worry, that there's potentially a role for Britain to be a leader in things like human rights, to be supportive of investment in inequalities through aid. But I think that because of our domestic political situation, there is a pivot away from that, which I worry is not for the best.
Very interesting, great insight. So we're going to move on to our next question, which is, what are your thoughts on the structure and organization of the United Nations? And having a UN Security Council, is having a UN Security Council beneficial or a hindrance on having global cooperation? Remi, can you start us off?
A lot of thoughts about this. I'll try and keep it as short as possible. I don't know if everyone's aware, in 2020, Canada lost its bid to join the UNSC. That was the second time Canada's failed to try and join it, which is a little tough just in terms of like I said, in our kind of how to maneuver foreign policy. This would have been a good step for Canada. Fortunately, it didn't happen. I guess to summarize, I get the UNSC was established for. It basically was trying to facilitate threats to the maintenance of peace globally. I get that. I think just in terms of contemporary challenges coming up, it has definitely exposed the UN kind of being able to not evolve with changes in geopolitics. I think the biggest thing that we've seen, especially Syria highlighted that very well, was the UNSC's kind of responsive rather than reactive approach in confronting like when it's an actual crisis. And I think that comes from a lot of international consensus not happening just because of the permanent seats being able to veto everything just in terms of their own domestic gain, which is hard. So we saw this in 2011 when we were like, hey, we got to make a decision. P5 members all gridlocked just because they had all different plans and interests in this, which was hard because a lot of things that US and Russia vote on, they are completely split on, which obviously leads to a deadlock, which obviously leads to absolutely nothing getting done. It leads to a stalemate. So I think because of that, it's just the ability of the UNSC not to be able to be utilized as an effective response for effective platform for responding to crises, I think needs to change. Like I said, I get the structure of it. It's just in terms of contemporary challenges coming up, I just don't think it's as effective as the four founders would have liked it to be.
Awesome, great response. Katrina, your turn.
Yeah, I think very much like similar to Remi. I think it's the UN, and particularly the UNC, is a really interesting structure. I think it's one of these, people are often like, oh, the UN's ineffective, it doesn't do anything, which I can understand where that comes from. But I think it's one of these structures that the world is probably still on balance better through having it, but it's never going to be an organization or system or structure that is able to set out kind of everything it achieves, because I think a lot of it, because of that kind of the domestic politics and relations between states. But I think that there are particular areas in terms of like broader issues affecting, like, I think in order for particularly the UN Security Council to be more effective, we need to move beyond specifically kind of country X invading country Y and kind of that sort of type of conflict. I think we don't exist in an era of that anymore. A lot of conflict is drones moving in, it's covert operations, it's kind of, we don't have large scale conflict in the same way that there has been in previous decades. But I think that we still have a lot of security issues, like the security, like women in particular are really vulnerable, issues like genocide, which I know we've talked about. And I think that it's in those areas where the UN Security Council could be a really powerful kind of tool for kind of achieving some cooperation and shared solutions there. But I think requires a little bit of just thinking about what is the aim of this body? What is the aim of cooperation? What are the limits of just international relations and negotiating with other states? And I think that's how to make it the most effective it can be. But agree, there's always going to be issues trying to get countries in the world to agree on everything.
Sounds good. All right, let's try to keep it more brief because we have one more question and then we're going to try to go to Q&A. Devira, your turn.
Well, I think Remi and Katrina has summarized a little bit of like what I wanted to say, but I think what I want to highlight from this the establishment of UN Security Council is that the very unequal distribution of power within the council that has become, the core of the problems. I think how not only the veto power that the P5 countries have, but also like how they manage to accept application from like the member states to enter UN Security Council, and how like it kind of like like that hinders the main goal of maintaining world peace. Because this the reason why UN Security Council established, because they try to maintain world peace, they try to minimize every single conflict, international conflicts, not to to minimize international conflicts. But when it comes to that organization being established, and then there's a very unequal distribution of power within the council, and that always becomes the main problem of why these ideas within its foundation mostly benefit the superpowers. So yeah, that's the first thing that I would like to say. And the second thing is that I'm not trying to be pessimistic here, because I think like our discussion is very pessimistic about like the existence of the United Nations. But I think in other cases, the United Nations have been really helpful to when it comes to humanitarian aids, like education or industrial development. I see a lot of acceleration in terms of industrialization, or trying to improve economic growth of low income countries. So that's a good thing. But I think for the most part, UN has acted as a puppet for powerful countries. That's what I think.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right, Kaneez, you're going to finish us off for this question.
I have nothing new to add, so we can totally just move on. I would disagree with what everyone's been saying. At the end of the day, the UN is just really like a force. They're not really a force to be reckoned with. No one takes it really seriously. I feel like students take it seriously. We love that stuff. But in terms of just like the most they have is the power of suggestion, right? There's no military backing them up. The most you can do is that member states really put in like the money where their mouth is. But for the most part, like the world is definitely better off with it, but there's going to be always room for improvement. And I want to believe that like any institution is going to be as good as its people. So if people created it, they can make it better. So we can totally move on to the next question.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. All right, this is kind of shifting gears for kind of looking at Canada and kind of how we fall on the foreign affairs map. How do you or your country perceive Canada on the global stage? What do you think Canada's strengths are, and where do you think we can improve? Katrina.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting being Scottish. There's a strong link there between kind of Canada and Scotland. Like my grandparents lived in Canada for a bit. So I kind of have always had like a bit of an affinity there to Canada. I think it's interesting. I was reading an article the other day off the back of the G7 summit. It was interesting. I think it was Remi, you were talking about Canada being a kind of not that big an actor in foreign policy and like a bit of a kind of add-on to these like big superpowers. And I think the UK is similarly moving to a similar sort of position. So I think potentially there's room for, I think there's always been cooperation, but kind of more kind of collaboration and like kind of bilaterally there. But the other thing which I know like we've kind of has been alluded to or mentioned, which like I've done a lot of kind of tried to do some like learning and educating about, is like the situation Canada has and the relationship with its Indigenous population. I think that's something where I think so many countries in the world are really having to look at whether if they're advocating human rights internationally, they really need to be looking inward at the issues which are going on there. And I think that's something in the UK that similarly kind of needs to be done. But I would say that's something from Canada that is, I think, becoming more of an issue, and there seems to be more talk about it. And there was a lot of nodding. I think everyone here kind of understands. But it would be interesting, I think, to see more development of that from those up in power and seeing some kind of meaningful change rather than just talk, which I think is the feeling from an outsider that I kind of get on that particular issue.
That's awesome. I think a lot of Canadians would agree with that statement. Kaneez, your turn.
I'll be honest, I think Americans don't think much about Canada at all, if I'm being totally honest. I think Canada definitely does have like that perception of being pretty neutral, when in reality we know in the US that Canada will be our ally no matter what. I think very rarely are there any kind of points of divergence. But in terms of like, I think it would be great if like there was a little bit more friction in that relationship, because I don't think it's healthy in any relationship to be completely on board with what the other party's saying. Like there's not going to be any room for growth. So I think it would definitely matter a little bit more, like, or this relationship could be a lot more powerful than it is right now, if like either the US forced Canada to do like, I guess, more good in terms of like the Indigenous populations, or Canada, you know, kind of tried to influence the US in terms of like what our positionality on like Israel, Palestine, for example, or something like that. But I think that would definitely be hard, because in terms of like foreign policy goals and strategic agenda, the US and Canada are kind of one and the same. Like I don't really know like where they could be more different. It just seems like they're really kind of like they have the same goals. So it's kind of hard to really pinpoint where the issue is, or like, yeah, I mean, I think Canada's our lackey, like at the end of the day. So
awesome. Thank you so much. All right, Devira, your turn.
That is completely different perspective that I have, because in Indonesia, you know, as a seeing from a third world country's perspective, that's very much different than, you know, maybe in the UK and also in the US, like how close they are with Canada. But I think from my observation and how like Indonesia perceived Canada, Canada has made a lot of a contribution, not only to the global world in general, but also especially to developing countries. One of the example would be like Indonesia has been supported a lot by Canada. So Canada has been a huge support for us, especially when it comes to economic development. I think lately Canada has just given economic aid for about $5 billion or something to Indonesia to help with the economic growth and to tackle to face with the economic recession from the pandemic. So seeing from the third world countries perspective, we see Canada as something, as some you know, sort of countries that we look up to and we try to build good relations with, because knowing that this country is this big superpowers country, like we need, not gonna lie, we need their money to help us, like, you know, build our economic growth. But in terms of maybe Canada's relations with other countries, especially with the United States, I kind of agree with what Kaneez said, because I see that Canada's relationship with the US, it's almost the same as Japan with the US. It's like Canada is almost like their puppet, because like every single thing that US said, all Canada always agreed to. Almost every time Canada agreed to it, or Canada followed that rules or regulations that what the United States wants, and that also happened with Japan. So I think that needs some improvement to actually show a clear stance on like which international alliance or Canada is at. So that's something that I want to address. Maybe that's something that Canada should improve. But this is just like a general ideas that I have in mind. Yeah, maybe I could be wrong, but please correct me. But okay, that's all.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. And I guess, Remi, I guess it's more of a question of what's your perception of Canada on the global stage?
Yeah, I mean, everyone kind of spoke very frank in terms of how they see Canada. Like I said, I think it'd be a big step if Canada did get a seat on the UNSC, just in terms of being able to make those decisions and possibly veto the US on some decisions without kind of the US holding it above their heads, being like, well, we'll pull back on trade. Obviously, I still think they would do that behind closed doors, but in that forum, I think would be a good opportunity for Canada kind of to show its autonomy and be like, you know what, we do have different diverging opinions from the US, and like, this is what we're going to do. I also think that it would be a really beneficial thing if it's not really foreign policy, but if Canada kind of took what New Zealand did in terms of using their platform to talk about Indigenous rights and like what they did. If you look at New Zealand's kind of framework for how they not dealt with, but worked in tandem with the Indigenous culture there, and all the beneficial things that they've done in terms of being able to try and understand and work with the Indigenous culture. I think Canada obviously has a lot to work on, but I think that they are, despite our flaws, are still kind of eons ahead of the treatment of Indigenous people in terms of places like the US, in terms of like Australia. So I think that we have a really kind of niche thing where we can kind of hone in and take it onto an international platform and be like, hey, this is what we've done. These are the steps that we've taken. Hopefully you can kind of take a page from our book. So that obviously is not foreign policy, but I think it's something that we can definitely take the reins on to try and kind of make it more equitable for Indigenous people living in different parts of the world.
That's awesome. Okay, we're gonna switch gears and I'm gonna hand it over to Evan, and he's gonna take over our Q&A portion. Thank you so much for participating in the structured discussion. That was awesome. I loved hearing your guys' responses.
Thanks, Sophia. Yeah, so if you have any questions, please private message me. Let me know if you would like to say it yourself or if you'd like me to read it out for you. Bronwyn had messaged me and it seems like she has a question, so I'll hand it over to her.
Thank you, Evan. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to the panelists. It was great to hear you talk, and it was kind of comforting to hear that amongst all social science students, there is kind of that universalized thing of your parents pushing you into STEM. But yeah, I thought I would ask you guys sort of a question that I think about a lot as a political science student and as somebody who gets involved a lot in organizations that work to get young people involved in politics. When you're sort of studying politics or international studies, I feel like there is sort of this inevitable feeling of dread of how am I going to solve these? How am I going to make a difference in the issue? Kind of brewing an apathy within students in the discipline. How have you personally dealt with this sort of sense of apathy? Have you ever experienced this? Or do you think there are solutions within the discipline to help students kind of bypass this sort of sense of helplessness?
I could answer that question. First of all, when I was an international studies major, politics major, I spent most of college crying because I was very upset So it was not great. Just because it did, like, I think it wasn't even like it wasn't apathy I was feeling, but it was more just like disappointment, I guess, that, you know, I think when you're younger, it's like you're just a student, right? Like, what power do you have? And it's really easy to kind of get caught up in the big picture. But I think it's really important, and something that's really helped ground me was to start small. Like, think about tangibly, what can you really do, you know, in terms of just like, and it's not just in terms of thinking big in terms of like the big conflicts in the world, but just starting small in your community. Right now, everyone is so engaged on social media. Like, I think Sophia actually reached out to me on Instagram. So it's one of those things where like, that is a great way to just connect with people. And even just little things, like sometimes on my Instagram stories or when people post, I'll see like someone's in crisis, right? Like someone really needs money because they can't pay their rent for the month. And it's like, it's not my friend, but it's like a friend of a friend. Venmo them 20 bucks, you know? Like, it's so hard to kind of like stress the importance of money in the world, but especially in our field, I think we don't talk about it enough. But like, unfortunately, a lot of solutions, right, toward these kind of big conflicts or even small conflicts, it's not that they can be resolved by money, because you can't keep pouring like funds into a broken system, right? But in terms of like thinking about what are your immediate goals, what are your immediate solutions versus long-term, like what's the long-term game plan, right? And I think as like students, you need to think about both. Like, something they really talk about in school is just like, well, what's a good policy recommendation? What do you do? It's like, okay, like, what are you trying to solve? Are you trying to solve the immediate, like, you know, consequences of violence, like on the ground? Or are you talking about like your sustainable development 20 years from now, right? And I think as students, you really need to put your foot in both worlds, like in the present, but also in the future, because you want to make sure that the actions you're taking today also leave a positive imprint for like the future generations or whatever. But yeah, it's completely normal to feel apathetic. It's completely normal to feel overwhelmed and frustrated and like you want to give up, and it's like, what's the point? But it's also important to realize like, hey, you don't have to go work for the State Department. You don't have to go work for, like, you don't have to go be an ambassador, right? Like, you can do the littlest things in your own community. If you're interested in like international development, think about different immigration, I guess like think about different immigration communities in your country, right? In your city, is there a nonprofit that helps them? Volunteer to teach English. Like, things like that is like helping immigrants assimilate to a new country, hugely helpful. Or even like little things, like think about, I think there's a huge difference between like the way that you look at different issues. Like, there are identity-based issues and there's like cause. So things like environment, it's like a cause-based issue, but things are like LGBTQ plus rights is an identity-based issue. And I think it's, I mean, as much as we want to do everything, I think it's really important to have a focus. Like, where do your strengths lie? Where do you feel like that personal calling, right? And just taking it from there, and then not feeling really married to any one specific cause. I don't want to go over time. Okay, that's enough for me.
Does anyone else have any comments on that, or I can move on to the next question?
I just said, I know we're stretched for time, but it was something that someone once said to me, which really stuck with me, which is, you can change the world, but you can't change it all at once, and you can't change it by yourself. So find something that you can do. You can't do everything, and don't go at it alone. If you have other people around you, then it's much more manageable. But that's always something that stuck with me, because I've very much had similar feelings of that kind of apathy and frustration.
Thank you. So I have one question from someone who couldn't make it today, but submitted a Q&A question. So what are some things that you feel need to change or progress in the field of IR or IS?
I don't want to monopolize the discussion, but I'm a very cynical person. I'm trying not to be. But I guess something that needs to be changed, I think, in the field of like IR or IS is the way it's being taught. Because I think we really fixate a lot about past events and just really studying history, which is great. I think it's a great foundation. But at least I know that when I graduated, I just didn't feel prepared for the real world. Because at the end of the day, no one teaches you the little things about like, how do you write a good policy recommendation? How do you write a good summary of a research journal? You know, like I really do think before we even get into the nitty gritty of like what needs to be changed in the real world, right? We need to think about how we're developing practitioners, right? Because right now, like you just have a lot of different idealists who talk over each other and they say the same things. And then it's like, you don't really get anywhere. At least that's what my perspective has been. So I think that needs to change. We need to really think about like creating like more solution-based education methods where not only are you studying things, but you're thinking critically about how to tackle these issues and not just in a, let's have more dialogues. Let's do like, you know, kumbaya. Like that's not going to work, man. Like you can't just tell like Israelis and Palestinians to get along and like, it's going to, you know, we're all going to go home and like have a picnic. Like that's not how it works. So I think that's something that we need to be a little bit more realistic about, is just like, how do you go beyond like the ego? How do you go beyond like talking about things in a really smart way and actually do things that actually matter on the ground and to people that you say you say you care about?
Thank you. Anyone else have any comments?
May I just like a little bit of comment on that, on top of that? I think like it's true, but the education system, I see how maybe when we're talking about practical skills, like I totally agree what Kaneez said, but I think also at the same time, like when we study IR, it is not solely, like it's completely focused on the European perspective. So somehow like, yeah, that's it's very Eurocentric view when we study about IR on how like, you know, for example, the Britain colonized these like other like smaller countries and how like they've been looked up to. So I think the way like even the study been taught to students is a little bit more like biased. So I've been thinking about it a lot when I started college and started you know, studying IR, because I came from Indonesia, which is somewhere in the Southeast Asian, you know, part of Southeast Asian countries. And when I studied in Japan, you know, I thought I would be cool. Like I would have a more like, you know, broader perspective about the world. But turns out like when I'm studying here and compared to my friend who also study IR in Indonesia, we basically talk about the same issues. We cover the same conflicts from a one point of view, which is, I found it very, I don't know, interesting and also intriguing, because why would we talk about, you know, we would try to save the world, try to maintain the world peace, and try to, you know, minimize conflict and try to solve these kind of issues. But why do we have to always talk about it from one perspective, which is the European countries or Western countries? So why do we have to always talk about it from Western perspective? We barely even like talk about it or bring up issues from the Eastern or like South world like perspective. So I think this is one of the reasons why like I really want to study more about IR and really want to indulge myself to just like explore more in the IR field, IR study. And I've been talking about this a lot with my professors, and you know, because all of my professors here, like they're from US, UK, Canada, or other countries, basically Western countries. So basically they also have the same ideas or the same thought about this, the same opinions. So I think that's also one of the reason, not the reason, like one of the thing that need to be deconstructed somehow, that even the study of IR is very biased. That's the thing that I just want to add.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions. So I think we're gonna end our meeting today. Thank you all for being here. Remi had to hop off for another meeting. I know you guys are all busy. Sophia will do a short conclusion and then we can head on our ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan. I would like to thank everyone for coming out and supporting our IS panel today. We would love to thank our panelists for coming out and taking the time. UR POLIS has a few more exciting panels coming up in the next few months, which will likely be in the fall semester. to stay up to date with anything UR POLIS, make sure to check us out on our social media platforms. And that concludes our panel for this morning, evening, afternoon. Hope everyone stays healthy and happy and has an amazing week. But thank you all for coming out. That was awesome. Thank you. You guys are awesome.
Thanks, guys.
Thank
Just happy to hear from everyone. Bye.